I remember when Mike came and proposed to have this George P. Shultz lecture, and we talked about it a little while, and we said, we'll do something distinctive in San Francisco. Our lecturer will always be a high-ranking military officer. Nobody else does that. For a while, it was hard to get anybody to come because they figured, I'd come to San Francisco, my God, I got killed. But then when Jim Jones was commandant, he came and it worked out well, and so we've had a parade. And this evening we have a really outstanding Admiral Jim Stavridis, to talk to us. He is a genuine warrior scholar.
This is Kim Jong-un. You hear a lot about him these days. He's well named, Kim Jong-un. He's unpredictable. He's untested. He's untried. He's unstable. He's not crazy. He has his own worldview, and it is a strategically sensible view when you look at his background, his life, and how he looks out from the Korean Peninsula. But I will tell you, there's the danger. You should think of it as kind of two streams that are coming together. One stream is nuclear weapons that can be hardened and miniaturized, and the other stream are ballistic missiles, intercontinental increasingly. When those two streams cross, and they are quite close to crossing, we will have a very fundamental decision to make, and that's why we spend a fair amount of time at the United Nations over the past few days talking about North Korea. So North Korea is a significant challenge in the region, and it's not the only challenge. Upper left, North Korea. Upper right, Chinese ballistic missile submarines, this rising Chinese Navy. Bottom left, artificial islands being built in the South China Sea, an attempt by China to claim sovereignty over that vast sea space, and through that South China Sea moves 80% of the economy of Asia. So we have geopolitical challenges. We do have allies. I would predict that this theater, this ocean, this Pacific Ocean, will be the scene of a great deal of geopolitical activity and challenging in this century. The most dangerous and violent countries in the world are not Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. They are Central America because of these, the maras, the gangs. We all here in the United States have been watching closely and feeling with heavy hearts the damage to my home state, Florida, over the last 24 hours, terrible blows in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean islands almost destroyed, natural disasters, again, leading to waves of refugees. So the Caribbean, while not a zone of great power competition, has its own set of challenges. Fortunately, we have interagency cooperation, including, as I mentioned, the Coast Guard. Look at that bottom right. That's actually a very hopeful picture. That's a high-tech Coast Guard vessel that's capturing a drug runner. The bad news is that the high-tech Coast Guard vessel is the one on the bottom in the photograph. The thing on the top that looks like Batman's submarine, that was built in the jungle of Colombia. And when we caught this thing, when I was Southern Command, and truth in advertising, there's a Navy destroyer just outside the picture. When we caught that thing, it had 10 tons of cocaine in it. Street value, $150 million right out there in San Francisco. So these are the challenges here in this region, and again, significant part of them happen at sea. Well, let's go to the top of the world. Let's go to the Arctic. This is the USS Jeanette, a doomed Arctic exploration put on by the US Navy in the middle part of the 19th century. This is only 150 years ago, and yet many geographers felt and believed there was a temperate zone at the top of the Earth. I mean, we knew nothing about this part of the world. The Jeanette was locked in the ice, crushed, and sank. Most of its crew was killed. And here's a news flash. There is no temperate zone at the top of the world. But there might be in time because the ice is melting. Now, we could have a debate, I guess, about global warming and what causes it and how fast it's moving. But I'll tell you something as a simple mariner. The ice is melting. By the middle of this century, year-round, we'll be able to sail across the top of the world. And that has significant implications for geopolitics, and it has significant implications for hydrocarbons and the recovery of hydrocarbons, because at the top of the world, on one side is the Russian Federation, and on the other are 5 NATO nations: the United States, Canada, Denmark by virtue of Greenland, Norway. Those nations, looking across an increasingly open seaway, that red line right across the middle is the sea lane of communication by the middle of this century, not so far away. Fortunately, we have organizations like the Arctic Council, which seek to create a fora where nations can talk about these challenges. And the United States needs to up its game in the Arctic. I'm now showing you a picture of our one heavy icebreaker, Coast Guard vessel. Denmark, a nation of 5 million people, has 5 icebreakers. China, a nation, last time I checked, which has no Arctic footprint, China has 12 icebreakers. Russia has 26. We need to up our game. Well, let's wrap up this voyage by looking broadly at the oceans, because I've talked to you about individual seas. We should remember that the oceans are, in one sense, the largest crime scene in the world. Illegal fishing, underreported fishing. This is a multi-billion-dollar business, and it is compounded by piracy in a wide variety of areas in the world. And also, because of the warming of the oceans, we are seeing more and more loss of that photosynthesis, and we are seeing massive amounts of plastics and pollution. In the center of the Pacific is a field of plastic the size of the state of Texas. So the oceans have challenges that are natural, man-made, and geopolitical.
I think you said that Kim Jong-un was unstable but not crazy.
Correct. His number one goal is his self-preservation, that of his family and his cronies. Number 2, his longer-term goal is to dominate the Korean Peninsula. And he's been very clear about that. That's been the goal of North Korea for decades. And number 3, he would like to gain respect on the stage of the world. So with those 3 goals in mind, I think your question, Jane, is exactly right. Can sanctions influence it? I think they can. The one red line he has, in my view, is, unfortunately, his nuclear weapons. He has watched what happened to Gaddafi when he gave up nuclear weapons, what happened to Saddam Hussein when he gave up nuclear weapons, what happened to the nation of Ukraine when they gave up nuclear weapons. They're now occupied by Russian forces. He believes he has to hold on to those weapons because they fulfill all 3 of the objectives he has. So I think our best approach is going to be a combination of strong deterrence coupled with sanctions that eventually drag him to 4-party or potentially 6-party talks. 4-party, US, China, North Korea, South Korea. 6-party, add Russia and Japan. Drag him to the table. I think the best we're going to be able to do without going to a war in North Korea is to freeze his nuclear program, and specifically to freeze his intercontinental ballistic program. I think it is, unfortunately, unrealistic to believe we're going to find a way for him to give up those weapons peacefully. And I'll close, if I may, by saying we ought to look, speaking of the oceans, we ought to look at a naval blockade. Again, I'm suspicious of historical analogy, but if you look back to the Cuban Missile Blockade, pretty effective, and it gave the initiative to the United States. It took it away from the Soviet Union. I think we need to gain the initiative here. That would be a way to couple with sanctions, and drag him to the table and hopefully freeze the program. I think the nuclear strategic deterrent with China is sufficient and in an appropriate place. Where I think we are in a Wild West with China is in cyber. And here we see Chinese activity both in terms of theft of intellectual property, of traditional espionage, but increasingly finding and probing into our infrastructure. That, I think, is the most worrisome trade space we have with China, along with the disagreement about the South China Sea. Let me tell you what I think we should do about it geopolitically. We should get closer to India. In 200 years, a historian's going to write a history of the 21st century. It's not going to be about the rise of China. It'll be about the rise of India because of demographics, because it's a democracy, because it has English as an elite language that connects it to the world. India, for all of its challenges with corruption and infrastructure and 1,000 other things, I'd bet on this century on India. So a way to think of this is US, European Union, our value set, our democracy, China rising. 21st century is about India. Where does India end up aligned? We would be very smart to be working to move India here. That's how we can balance geopolitically. That's how we balance China. Doesn't mean we're going to war, but it means we're creating a network of alliances.